At the end of the 1950s, two Škoda Coupés based on the 1100 OHC Roadster began taking part in Czech road races. While they did enjoy some success in local races, their racing career didn't last long. The 1960s saw a new category of racing cars, and the OHC Coupé went into retirement. Enthusiasts from ŠKODA Česana bought the two cars, but in the end, both were written off in crashes. One of them was so burned that its unique all-aluminium body was destroyed. Nevertheless, today's Simply Clever podcast is all about the wonderful coupé, which was nicknamed the Czech E-type. This is because a few years ago, workers at ŠKODA Museum joined forces with the ŠKODA Auto Prototype Construction Center to revive this burnt-out coupé using original plans, modern technology, and above all, the enormous enthusiasm and determination of everyone involved.
To auto je svým způsobem krásný a práce na tom byla taky krásná. Lidi to hrozně bavilo.
Musel jsem se smát už při tom nastupování.
Je to rozkop.
The original OHC was also a prototype. The guys at Česana continued the traditional craft of their predecessors, while also using their experiences of developing new ŠKODA models to recreate the vehicle's aluminum body. The new coupé blends 1960s racing technology with the latest approach still used in the car industry today.
This car is a racing circuit special built at the turn of the 1950s and 60s, and it was designed for racing on the circuits of former Czechoslovakia. It followed on from a series of 22 ŠKODA 1100s, OHCs, that had a fiberglass open body. This coupé, however, had an aluminum body, and two copies were made. This body is entirely aluminum, including all partitions and reinforcements. And so the only things made of plastic are these petrol pump switches, indicators, and the steering wheel.
Takže opravdu jsou tady plastová táhla přepínačů, benzínové pumpy a kontrolek a volant a to je vše.
Tady se podařilo konstruktérům vyladit.
The designers managed to achieve an almost 50-50 weight distribution with the front-wheel drive unit transmission and transfer case in the back. Brakes are drum brakes, but right at the transmission case and transfer case unit, so the unsprung masses aren't that large, and the suspension comes from this. The car's ground clearance was controlled pretty accurately, and this was a top-quality car for its time. I remember as a kid, we'd go and watch the races at Mladé Boleslav, or the Čista circuit where Jarda Bobek, Fošek, and Hozák raced, and they put these cars through their paces.
Mladé Boleslavy nebo Čistecký okruh, kde Jarda Bobek, Václav Bobek starší, Fousek, Hozák, Widner a tito velikáni prostě s těmito auty jezdili.
These 1100 OHC factory vehicles raced at the very top of the national championships, but because of the turbulent times, they did not travel abroad much. The OHC only competed abroad twice, once in Budapest, Hungary, and again in what was then Leningrad. Otherwise, they faced little domestic competition. In races with 12 vehicles, only one or two could actually compete with them. The rest were only there to fill up the field. These ŠKODA OHC cars were produced at the peak, or almost the end of the era of the two-seater sports cars.
And they stopped racing in the late 1950s.
This category then began to fade away, and from 1964, it was no longer an official category. That's when racing shifted to monoposto racing. Formula 3 was established, giving new life to racing.
A tehdy se to závodění vlastně přesunulo na závodění s monoposty, vznikly monoposty Formule 3 a to byla taková zase nová krev do toho závodění.
A tyhle kusy vlastně dva.
And these two copies were left parked somewhere in Česana.
Tak oba dva otevřené.
So both open cars and both coupés were left by the wayside in Česana, and it was decided that one open car would be given to the promotions department, the second open car, and both coupés were sold to private buyers.
Obě dvě kupé šly na odprodej soukromým zájemcům.
Což byl
And one of those was your dad.
One was my dad, and the second coupé was bought by Hanuš Hrabanek, while the other open vehicle was bought by a guy in Prague, who even emigrated with it in 1968. He drove it all the way to England, where the car changed ownership several times. Today, it's owned by ŠKODA. Dušan Velebný and I used to work at the testing center. I was a car mechanic, and he was the test engineer for this vehicle, including these two laminate pieces. Nobody was doing anything with it, and we were young, so we thought for fun we could ask the company to sell it to us. Either they'd reject the idea or agree. And since I was racing competitively at the time, and doing quite well, I think, and Dušan Velebný was a good engineer, so the company signed it over, and we purchased it.
Dušan Velebný byl dobrý motorář, tak to podnikový podepsal, no tak jsme to odkoupili.
Compared to today's cars, the OHC is out of this world in terms of height. It comes up to an adult's waist, and even Class A cars like the Fabia seems huge in comparison. But the Coupé really stood out on Czechoslovak roads even in its time.
Fakt je, že se za tím autem každý ohlédl, ale...
It's true that everyone stared at the car. But then again, the roads weren't as busy, and it wasn't something you drive slowly. In fact, there was no speed limits, so people didn't have much time to catch sight of it. I did make a lock for it here, but the only real security feature was the fact that I always removed the steering wheel and took it with me when I left the car.
If Dušan Velebný and Hanuš Hrabánek hadn't worked out at Česana and therefore had no experience of similar cars, they probably wouldn't have bought the OHCs. These days, Hanuš Hrabánek says that only a couple of crazy young guys like Dušan Velebný and he could have done it.
People were hardly queuing up to buy it because you couldn't drive it in the winter, right? The wind would blow through every hole. The frame made a noisy racket the whole time. It was a racing car, so after every race, you'd have to check it and adjust it, etc.
Ultimately, the fact that everyday life with a racing car wasn't easy actually saved this specific coupé.
Jediný, co mě kazilo radost, byla ta vysoká spotřeba, až to bylo 25 a 20 litrů.
The only thing that spoiled the fun was the high fuel consumption, which was 20 to 25 liters for every 100 kilometers, which eventually led me to return to the 1100 engine. I got a 50 horsepower engine from a ŠKODA Felicia in return. I got 8 liters for every 100 kilometers. So I swapped it and was happy with it.
A jezdil jsem za 7-8 litrů, takže to jsem přemontoval a byl jsem spokojený.
That's already a good consumption, yeah. But it's also thanks to you that the car is working today. That's the reason you did it.
Saved it, you could say, sure, but there were no problems with the car itself.
Mr. Hrabánek couldn't have known it at the time, but since the engine had been in the depository at the vocational school in Mladá Boleslav for many decades, we were able to rebuild the OHC.
Táta ten vůz koupil v roce 66 a vlastně...
Our dad bought the car in 66 and I rode in it between the ages of 2 and 4. So I do have some sketchy memories of it. But I know that when our family began to grow and the car had to go, I remember that when a strange man got in the car and drove away, I did cry.
Pán do toho sednul a odjížděl dál, takže jsem to obrečel.
Fakt je, že já jsem potom začal dálkově...
I began studying a distance course at university while I was employed, so I didn't have a lot of time. And that's one reason I then sold it to one of my colleagues. And unfortunately, he crashed it. Car went up in flames, and he managed to get out of the rear window. So he was fine, but the car was a write-off, which was a shame.
Prostě to auto zničil, což byla škoda.
Pán měl větší štěstí než ten vůz, protože se mu povedlo...
The guy was luckier than the car as he managed to escape the burning vehicle. The bodywork didn't survive the flames. The only thing left in the fire was a burnout chassis, the frame, axle, series engine, and transmission. Thank goodness a collector from Jaromíř took it on and he had the vehicle in his collection for a long time. In the end, we managed to buy what was left of the car from his estate in 2014.
The museum was initially considering only restoring the remaining fragments of the vehicle as an exhibition piece. In the end, Mr. Velebny and his colleagues decided that the coupé still had life in it, and they launched a highly ambitious and unique project to rebuild the entire car. For the reconstruction, the ŠKODA Museum Restoration Workshop joined forces with the ŠKODA Auto Prototype Construction Center, just as the original coupé had been made at the end of the 1950s. And because the original 2D vehicle drawings had been preserved, a grid of 3D curves covered with surfaces could be made at a 1:1 scale. This digital OHC model then had to be compared to surviving photographs.
V Mladé Boleslavi máme v archivu pořádek.
Here in Mladá Boleslav, we've meticulously maintained archives, and so we've got drawings from the time of Mr. Lorin and Clement, of their first motorcycles and cars. So we have almost complete drawings for this coupé. The only aspect where we came up short was the rear lights, which we had to reconstruct following this open model.
So how did the decision come about that you'd rebuild the body of this vehicle again? Because it isn't a traditional reconstruction that you regularly do. Here behind us is a vehicle that is reconstructed, but most of the parts had survived. And it's just some smaller components that need to be dealt with. The body is usually at least somewhat preserved.
Whenever we restore vehicles like that, there's always something small, some part that's missing. So our first step is to go into the archives or find the spare parts. For this special, though, you won't find anything in the spares because only 2 were produced. And the parts are so different from the mass-produced models that you can't find them anywhere else. So our first step took us to the archives. The drawings for the body were fairly complete, so we contacted our colleagues from prototype construction, and they took these traditional ink drawings on tracing paper, developed them, scanned them, and turned these ink lines into virtual curves. The process of developing and reconstructing this new body began with piecing them together in 3 dimensions.
Proložili ty čáry tuší, proložili virtuálními křivkami, no a poskládali z toho 3D a začal proces vývoje.
How much persuasion did they need? Because this isn't exactly a standard project they might encounter.
It's anything but a standard project. But they didn't take much convincing, in fact. They were very enthusiastic. If it could be done 60 years ago, then we can do it again. The company management gave us their support, and the project got the green light.
To begin with, we are here in front of a screen where we can see, let's say, the skeleton of the body comprising individual curves. Let's explain what we are actually looking at. This is the initial phase where you've transferred those paper plans into a digital format.
That's exactly right. We're looking at cross-sections of every 100 millimeters that we've transferred into computer format. These are the individual cross-sections plus some characteristic lines, cutouts or joints. And this was the only basis we had, or rather, the only technical basis. The second basis was some photographs, and we had to use these. This is all we had to go off of to model the car again in a surface model.
I'm actually asking as a layperson, how difficult is it to transform those 2D drawings into this form? I understand you have to scan them, but it must be possible to do some of it automatically?
Actually, no. All of it is manual work, so to speak. So I don't know if I can follow up, but just as you don't forget how to ride a bike, so I haven't forgotten the work I did around 25 years ago. So I remembered how I used to work, and so I made use of my knowledge. It's done according to these individual cross-sections of individual surfaces. You need to check that it all fits where it should. So it's quite difficult work. You need imagination. Of course, Mr. Velebny helped a lot with this, because various areas aren't even described. So yes, lots of gaps with the headlights, for example, and the rear corner bumper. So there was a lot of creativity involved there. Plus, of course, we had to stay true to the various photographs.
How different is this from standard jobs where you create new models?
Well, today, the shape or design of a car is produced in the design department, who give it a complete description, and the subsequent departments get the shape completely described, which in this phase was no different. The design was clear, and it was described in the way that was then common. So individual cross-sections plus photographs. We skipped this phase or left it out, but we had to fill in the gaps.
Following this basic skeleton, these surfaces we get to the drawings for those specific parts. We see here the body with the individual pieces designated by color, so that means the final documentation is ready for manufacture.
Right, exactly. This is the very final set of parts. The parts were constructed based on those surfaces we had a moment ago. Of course, when we were constructing it, we went by the drawings. We always tried to look everything up and to use the drawings. We had almost everything, but we did need to learn to read it all because it's highly concentrated. Velebny taught us a little, and when we weren't sure, we consulted the museum again regarding how it might be. And here are the fully constructed parts. That means they have all the bends, all the edges, all the internal construction is there. Everything's included, and also the method of joining.
Right, we see in these views right inside the body, there's a scan of the original frame that's preserved from the original.
Exactly. The frame there is scanned, so we didn't reconstruct that, nor the dock. It's just a scan. So the frame took quite some work to get into the car, since it isn't entirely flat or symmetrical. So yeah, I think it was quite hard putting it in there to fit into the car, because everything is connected to the frame and everything is based on it, so it was quite tricky.
How did you manage to work with the software? What was made was basically done by eye?
It was really tough work. It meant repeatedly shifting the rotation, and gradually we got it so it matched up. It isn't ideal, it's a compromise.
And this also meant that when you need to look at a particular part, for example, where it should be connected, then it was all correct and so on.
Before starting production using tools, before starting any manufacturing, we can test it all out. That means it's just here, the way it should be made. And there shouldn't be any issues. Here, for example, we kept everything as it was, but this driver's seat, for example, was wider than the passenger seat.
Yes, I tried it out for real, that's right.
And it was angled so that there were different cross-sections, so we weren't entirely sure if the surface would fit. So this was the only one we made out of polystyrene as a model. It does fit in at that height, so we tried to sit in it. Yeah, so almost everyone in the office tried it out and said, okay, that'll work. It was just about checking that it would work out, because making it for real would be expensive and we wouldn't want to find out it didn't work afterwards. It would be extremely costly, so that was another thing we had to test out in advance.
In working on the OHC, the guys in the prototype center brought together historical craftsmanship with cutting-edge technologies. But after creating the digital model of the coupé, everything went to the basics, production of the vehicle's aluminum body.
While we don't normally work with aluminum bodies, we're part of the VW group, and as a manufacturer of test vehicles, we work on projects that incorporate aluminum bodies. So we did have some basic knowledge in that arena.
Okay, so not entirely. It wasn't entirely your first time.
The character production was there already, but it was very different because making test pieces and prototype pieces requires a method where we try to approximate mass production as much as we can and to verify that the parts can be mass produced in the future, can be made in the prototype. Our approach here, however, was to find the simplest, cheapest way to produce one or two vehicles.
We've mentioned a number of times that much of it was done by hand, but these parts were mostly pressed and then modified in some way, or how did it work?
The surface of the part was done by machine wherever possible because we need high-quality surfaces. Other things, like this corner here, were completed manually.
Right, so whatever detail needed to be fine-tuned, that was done by hand. This photo shows the digital model as well as the car itself. So that means that the guys had this model available to them so they could turn it around and check it all fitted together and so on.
Ten modílek, aby se mohli natáčet, kontrolovat, jestli to všechno sedí a podobně?
Our staff are so experienced that they can even work with data. So many of the drawings were not needed in this project. And here we also worked with data and with the experience we had so that the effect was as good as possible.
Tak, aby ten výsledný efekt byl co nejlepší.
We've said several times that having the data meant we didn't need to any intermediate models. Lots of these things can be fine-tuned before anything is physically produced. How it worked out in the end, though, because you then had the opportunity to check if the data does fit in real life. When you put the finished parts on the original frame, like there, it fitted.
It fitted well, and when we found out something was missing, we consulted with construction and the staff, and we made the necessary piece, then we digitalized it. So we did it the other way around. One example is this handle here, which was nowhere in the data or the drawings, and so our colleague at Vrchlabí drew it himself, put it on a piece of paper, and we made it. And construction then digitalized it, and the problem was solved.
So it really was teamwork across the departments then.
It really was wonderful teamwork. People really enjoyed it. I have to say I haven't experienced a symbiosis like it for many years. It was a real joy to work on this model.
There was some special thing about the original vehicle. It was made by hand and two teams of metal workers worked on it, so the car wasn't entirely symmetrical. How did you deal with that? I assume it wasn't accurate to the exact millimeter, but when I looked at it, there don't seem to be any differences. So the car is more perfect than it originally was in a way.
Je to skutečně tak, je to samozřejmě zásluhou našich kolegů předem, kteří nám ty...
That's right. It's thanks to our colleagues who prepared the data for us to make it symmetrical. Then we only used the tools prepared for it, and one could say this problem had already been dealt with before. In terms of quality and our pride, we used the devices in production to help us, specifically the measuring equipment you can see here.
Zařízení, které nám pomáhalo, což jsou měřící stroje, které tady jsou i vidět.
What was the most complicated thing for you?
We made a historical vehicle meeting the quality requirements for new tests and prototype vehicles. The most complicated aspect for us was tracing the path from the state today to the state of the past. But again, we wanted to walk in our predecessors' footsteps. That means our fathers and grandfathers really drove us forwards.
Já tak předpokládám, tak jak jste zmiňoval, že už jste měli samozřejmě zkušenosti s...
You've said that you had already experiences working on aluminum parts, but going back to those original procedures must have been an interesting experience and can be somehow beneficial in the future. another experience that can help you in future prototypes?
That's absolutely right, because when you create a vehicle, you see how the individual parts are produced and the difficulty of making those parts. Then, of course, you gain experience in the process. And when you then use that experience to construct new vehicles using new technologies, it's priceless.
I see that the rear of the car is made out of 2 or 3 pieces. It's the frame that holds it together.
Right, and it's basically the frame that's the base. Everything is built on top of the frame. The individual parts are connected, and the joining technology is different compared to traditional bodies made of steel or tin. And the difference is that the aluminum bodies are mostly joined using rivets, and here we use over 5,000 rivets on this body. Each one had to be put in the right place, so the holes have to be manually knocked out, making the work more complex. And it isn't as simple as using a spot welder. There are also places where welding is used, but it's not that common.
Yeah, it's true that today riveting isn't done very often, and it certainly isn't visible where it is done.
That's also true. We do show the rivets. We looked at this, and since we wanted it to be as close as possible to the original model, we left the rivets as they were.
Jednak to není kam schovat, jednak by to každé takové schovávání.
They're also visible because there's nowhere to hide them. For one thing, hiding them would require more bends and more weight. And this is a vehicle for racing, so it's all visible. There's only a thin layer of paint too, purely aesthetic, minimal filler, and it's a real beauty.
Je to rozkoš.
Tell me, what a delight it was to drive it at Sosnova, because we drove it while we were filming, and you showed the OHC Coupé and Roadster at a public event on the circuit at Sosnova in front of an audience of a few thousand people. So how was it to drive it?
It's a really nice drive, and you do controlled skidding, so it's a real joy. So we're glad we've been able to show both cars together on one circuit in a parallel drive in front of spectators at Sosnova, because these two cars were last driven like this in 1961 between Čistá and Bela pod Bežděž. Since then, either two coupés or the two roadsters started, so it was really very symbolic.
Takže bylo to takové hodně symbolické.
Byl to nádherný pocit, musel jsem se smát.
Yeah, it felt wonderful. I laughed when I was getting in because it was harder today than when I was young, when you had the ride well rehearsed. Plus, there's that tremendous noise. You can't forget that. But otherwise, the technology here is excellent, and these are great memories of the wonderful 1960s.
Mr. Hrabánek got a ride in the newly built coupé as a gift for his 78th birthday, sitting in it again for the first time in 60 years. I had been interested to know if he was able to recognize the fact that it's an entirely new vehicle, that it is to say, how faithfully did the restorers and the guys in the prototype center manage to build the car.
You
don't normally notice the differences, even if you knew the original, but the passenger side was indeed slightly different to the true one. So if you had a long time to investigate it, and you knew how to look at it and where to look, today, as I say, the techniques and the technology are somewhere else entirely. And even the paint when you look at it. Although the rivets at the joints are visible, it's finished absolutely perfectly. And I remember that the original two aluminum coupés had a thin layer of very faintly blue paint. And there were some issues with this, so it was repainted red. It was a shade of red, but it was more of a matte brick red with white stripes, whereas this is just full of elegance and meets the standards of today.
Matová cihlová s těmi bílými pruhy, kdežto tohleto prostě to je elegance, která už snese i dnešní měřítka.
So the guys at the workshop and the prototype center did well.
They did well, and since I grew up in it, I know that the guys there are master mechanics. And as I said, they could even tie a bow in sheet metal.
Are you going to be driving it regularly?
Definitely not. It's a unique piece, and like any aluminum body, it is delicate. Any damage would show up immediately, so we'll be displaying it rather than driving it.
Takže chceme to více vystavovat, než jezdit.
Okay, so I'm wondering whether you'd take on another similar project if any such opportunity arose. Theoretically, could you do a similarly complex renovation?
We'll see. We've still got gaps in our collection, so perhaps we'll want to fill them.
Škoda. Simply clever.